The people of Millbrook, Kansas, had been whispering about the strange native girl for 3 months before anyone dared to approach her. She appeared every morning at dawn near Miller's Creek, the shallow waterway that divided the prosperous farming community from the reservation lands beyond the eastern hills. The girl would sit motionless for hours beneath the old cottonwood tree, her dark hair hanging like a curtain around a face that bore fresh scars on one side, her right arm hanging uselessly at her side as if it had never healed properly from some terrible injury. The children who walked to school along Creek Road would cross to the other side when they saw her sitting there, their parents having filled their heads with stories about that Indian girl who survived something awful, and warnings to stay away from people who carry that kind of darkness. The adults weren't much better, creating elaborate detours in their daily routines to avoid the stretch of road where she maintained her silent vigil. They called her the Scarred One when they thought no one was listening, and mothers would pull their children closer when her name came up in conversation at the general store. But Daniel McKinnon had been watching her from a distance for weeks, and what he saw was different from what the rest of the town claimed to see. From his position working the fence line of his family's 1,000-acre wheat farm, he could observe her through his father's old binoculars without being noticed. Where others saw something frightening and damaged, Daniel saw a young woman who moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to navigate the world while carrying physical and emotional wounds that others couldn't understand. She was perhaps 20, with long black hair that caught the morning light in ways that reminded him of the ravens that nested in his barn rafters. Her face, unmarked on the left side, showed a bone structure that spoke of both strength and delicacy, and even from a distance, he could see that her dark eyes held an intelligence that had nothing to do with the fear-based stories circulating through town. Daniel was 26, the eldest son of the McKinnon family that had farmed this land for 3 generations, and he had spent enough time around injured animals to recognize the difference between something dangerous and something wounded. This girl was wounded, not dangerous, and the way she sat so perfectly still for hours suggested someone who was healing, not someone who was planning harm. He had grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about the Kiowa and Comanche tribes that had once roamed these plains, stories that emphasized respect and understanding rather than fear, and he couldn't help but wonder what tragedy had brought this young woman to sit alone each morning where 2 worlds met but never touched. The breaking point came on a particularly cold October morning when Daniel arrived at his usual fence repair work to find the girl slumped against the cottonwood tree, her lips blue with cold, and her body shaking uncontrollably. She was wearing only a thin cotton dress and a worn denim jacket that provided little protection against the harsh Kansas wind that swept across the plains like ice water. Daniel dropped his tools and ran toward the creek, jumping across the narrow stream that marked the boundary between his family's land and the strip of neutral ground where she always sat. "Miss," he called out as he approached, his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "You're going to freeze to death out here." She looked up at him with eyes that were clouded with fever and exhaustion, but there was no fear in her gaze, only a resignation that broke his heart. "I'm Daniel McKinnon from the farm across the creek. You need to get warm, and you need help. Will you let me help you?" She tried to speak, but only a whisper came out, too soft for him to understand. When he knelt down next to her, he could see that her scarred right arm was severely infected, the wounds having reopened and turned an angry red that spoke of serious medical neglect. Without waiting for permission, Daniel carefully lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt, as if her spirit had been carrying most of her weight for months. "I'm taking you to Doc Morrison in town," he told her, though he wasn't sure she was conscious enough to understand. "Everything's going to be okay now." As he carried her toward his truck, Daniel felt the weight of a decision that would change everything about his carefully ordered life. He was a bachelor farmer who had never caused a moment of trouble for anyone, who attended church every Sunday and minded his own business in a community where conformity was valued above almost everything else. But looking down at this mysterious young woman who had somehow become part of his daily routine without him realizing it, he knew that he couldn't simply deliver her to the doctor and walk away. Something about her quiet presence had been calling to him for weeks, and now that she was literally in his arms, he understood that this moment had been inevitable from the first day he had seen her sitting beneath that tree. Dr. Morrison had been practicing medicine in Millbrook for 37 years, and he had learned to read both injuries and the stories behind them with the expertise of someone who had seen every type of trauma the Kansas plains could produce. When Daniel carried the unconscious native girl into his clinic, the doctor took one look at her infected arm and the pattern of scars on her face and immediately began asking questions that Daniel couldn't answer. "How long has she been sitting out there?" Dr. Morrison asked as he examined the girl's wounds while she lay unconscious on his examination table. "What do you know about how she got these injuries? Has anyone from the reservation been looking for her?" "I don't know anything about her," Daniel admitted, watching as the doctor cleaned wounds that were worse than they had appeared from a distance. "She's been showing up every morning for months, but no one in town has tried to talk to her. Everyone just avoids her." Dr. Morrison shook his head grimly. "These injuries are at least 4 months old, maybe 5. Burns on her face and neck. This arm was badly broken and never set properly, and she's malnourished. This girl has been living rough for a long time." During the next several hours, while Dr. Morrison worked to stabilize her condition and treat the infection that could have killed her, Daniel sat in the waiting room and tried to understand why he felt so responsible for someone he had never actually met. When Mrs. Henderson from the church auxiliary came by to deliver medical supplies and saw him there, her reaction was swift and predictable. "Daniel McKinnon, what are you doing mixed up with that Indian girl? Don't you know the stories about what happened to her? There's a reason she's living alone out there instead of with her own people." "What stories?" Daniel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice to the conspiratorial whisper that small-town gossips used when sharing information they weren't supposed to have. "My cousin works at the federal building in Topeka, and she heard from the Bureau of Indian Affairs people that this girl was involved in some kind of terrible incident on the reservation. Fire, violence, people died. They say she might have caused it, that her own family won't take her back because of what she did." Daniel felt anger rising in his chest. "And you believe that? You think a girl who can barely lift her right arm and weighs maybe 90 pounds is some kind of dangerous criminal? I'm just telling you what people are saying. There's a reason she's alone, Daniel. Sometimes people are alone because that's what they deserve." Before Daniel could respond to that heartless statement, Dr. Morrison appeared in the doorway. "She's awake," he said simply. "And she's asking for whoever brought her here." Daniel found the girl sitting up in the clinic bed, looking small and fragile against the white pillows but with eyes that were clear and alert. Her scarred arm was properly bandaged, and someone had given her a clean hospital gown that made her look even younger than she was. When she saw Daniel, she managed a small smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I remember you carrying me. I remember your truck. You don't need to thank me," Daniel said, pulling a chair close to her bed. "Anyone would have done the same thing." "No," she said with certainty. "Most people cross the street when they see me. You're the first person in months who got close enough to touch me." Daniel studied her face, noting how the scars created a pattern that suggested she had been protecting something or someone when she was injured. "What's your name?" "Luna," she said after a pause. "Luna Whitehorse." "Luna," Daniel repeated, liking the way the name sounded. "That's a beautiful name. It means moon in Spanish. My grandmother was Mexican. My mother thought it was pretty." She touched the scarred side of her face self-consciously. "Before this, anyway." "You're beautiful now," Daniel said without thinking, then felt his face redden when he realized how forward that sounded. "I mean, the scars don't change that." Luna looked at him with surprise, as if no one had called her beautiful in so long that she had forgotten it was possible. "You don't know what I did. You don't know why I'm alone." "Then tell me," Daniel said simply. "If you want to." For a long moment, Luna stared out the window toward the direction of the reservation. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There was a fire. A terrible fire at the community center. Children were inside, and I tried to get them out. The roof collapsed while I was carrying the last little boy. He died anyway, and I lived with these scars. Some people think I could have saved more if I had been faster, smarter, stronger. Some people think the fire was my fault for working late that night and leaving papers too close to the space heater. Daniel felt his heart breaking for this young woman who had clearly been carrying guilt and blame that weren't hers to carry. And that's why you've been sitting alone by the creek? Because people blame you for trying to save children? Because I failed, Luna said simply. Because children died and I lived, and every morning I sit there and wonder if I should have died instead of them. Daniel reached out and gently took her uninjured hand. Luna, you didn't fail. You survived. And surviving means you still have purposes to fulfill, still have good to do in this world. She looked down at their joined hands as if she couldn't believe someone was willing to touch her voluntarily. How can you be so sure? Because, Daniel said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. I've been watching you every morning for months, and I can see that you're someone who cares deeply about others. The way you sit so carefully, so respectfully, even the way you chose a place right at the boundary between two communities. You're not hiding from people. You're waiting for something. Or someone. Luna's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what I'm waiting for anymore. Daniel spent the next 3 days thinking about Luna Whitehorse while going through the motions of his regular farm routine. He milked the cows, repaired equipment, and checked on his wheat fields that were nearly ready for harvest, but his mind kept returning to the moment when she had looked at him with such surprise when he called her beautiful. Dr. Morrison had kept her in the clinic for observation, treating not only her infected arm but also addressing malnutrition and exhaustion that spoke of months of barely surviving. When Daniel visited her on the second day, he brought fresh apples from his family's orchard and found her sitting by the window, watching the street outside with the same quiet attention she had shown during her mornings by the creek. How are you feeling? He asked, noting that color had returned to her cheeks and her eyes were clearer. Stronger, she said, accepting an apple with a gratitude that made him realize how long it had been since anyone had offered her simple kindness. Dr. Morrison says I can leave tomorrow if I have somewhere to go. The statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Luna clearly had nowhere to go. She had been living outdoors for months, and whatever had happened on the reservation had cut her off from her family and community. Daniel had been thinking about this problem for days, and he had come to a decision that he knew would cause controversy but felt absolutely right. Luna, he said, sitting in the chair beside her bed, I have a proposal for you. It might sound strange, but I want you to hear me out. She looked at him with curiosity, setting down the apple she had been eating. My farm has a small guest house that my grandfather built for my grandmother's sister years ago. It's been empty since she passed away 5 years ago, but it's comfortable and private. You could stay there while you recover and decide what you want to do next. No expectations, no pressure, just a safe place to heal. Luna was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could see her considering not just his offer but all the complications it would create. Your community already fears me, she said finally. If I'm living on your land, they'll fear you too. They'll make assumptions about why you're helping me. Let them make assumptions, Daniel said with a conviction that surprised him. I know why I'm helping you, and that's all that matters. Why are you helping me? Daniel had been asking himself the same question for days, and he had finally found an answer that felt completely honest. Because you deserve help. Because you've been punished enough for surviving something terrible. And because I can't stand the thought of you sitting alone by that creek anymore, carrying pain that isn't even yours to carry. Luna's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. What if the stories about me are true? What if I really was responsible for those children dying? Then you'll have to live with that knowledge for the rest of your life, which is punishment enough, Daniel said simply. But I don't believe that's true. I think you're a woman who tried to save lives and survived when others didn't, and now you're being blamed for circumstances beyond anyone's control. That afternoon, Daniel drove Luna to the small guest house on his property, a one-bedroom cottage with a kitchen, sitting room, and porch that looked out over the wheat fields. It was simple but comfortable, furnished with handmade furniture and quilts that his grandmother had sewn decades earlier. Luna walked through the rooms slowly, touching surfaces as if she couldn't believe they were real. "I haven't been inside a real house since the fire," she admitted. "I've been sleeping in abandoned buildings, under bridges, anywhere people wouldn't find me." "This is your house now," Daniel said. "For as long as you need it." The next few weeks established a routine that felt natural to both of them but scandalized the town of Millbrook. Daniel would check on Luna each morning before starting his farm work, bringing fresh milk and eggs from his livestock and often staying for coffee while she told him about the books she was reading. He had discovered she was extraordinarily well educated, having graduated from the federal boarding school with honors before returning to work on the reservation. In the evenings, she would walk through his fields, moving with increasing grace as her injured arms slowly regained some function and her overall health improved. Luna had a gift for understanding plants and animals that amazed Daniel. She could predict weather changes by watching the behavior of his cattle, knew which wildflowers could be used for medicine, and had ideas for crop rotation that were more sophisticated than anything he had learned in agricultural school. When she offered to help with farm tasks, he discovered that despite her physical limitations, she had an intuitive understanding of farming that came from generations of indigenous knowledge about living in harmony with the land. But the disapproval from the community was immediate and intense. Mrs. Henderson organized a delegation of churchwomen to visit Daniel's mother, expressing concern about the family's reputation. The bank president mentioned to Daniel's father that certain associations might affect the farm's credit rating. Children were forbidden from walking past the McKinnon property, and several longtime family friends suddenly became too busy to maintain their usual social connections. The breaking point came when Reverend Collins visited Daniel directly, sitting in the farmhouse kitchen that had been the heart of McKinnon family life for generations. "Daniel," the Reverend said with the kind of pastoral authority that had intimidated Daniel since childhood, "I understand your Christian impulse to help someone in need, but this situation has gone beyond charity. People are talking about you and this girl in ways that are damaging to both your reputations." "What exactly are people saying?" Daniel asked, though he was sure he didn't want to hear the answer. "They're saying you're living in sin with a woman who isn't your wife. They're saying you've been bewitched by Indian magic. They're saying you're betraying your own people for someone who caused the deaths of innocent children." Daniel felt anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "And what do you think, Reverend? I think you're a good man who's letting misplaced sympathy cloud his judgment. This girl needs to return to her own people, Daniel. She doesn't belong here, and your association with her is causing division in our community. What if I told you that Luna is the most genuinely Christian person I've ever met?" Daniel said. "She spends her days caring for injured animals, reading scripture, and praying for the families of the children who died in that fire. What if I told you that helping her has made me a better man than I was before?" Reverend Collins looked uncomfortable. "Your intentions may be good, but the appearance of impropriety is almost as damaging as actual sin. The Bible tells us to avoid even the appearance of evil. The Bible also tells us to care for strangers and show hospitality to those who have been cast out," Daniel replied. "Which commandment should I prioritize?" After the Reverend left, Daniel sat alone in his kitchen, understanding that he had reached a crossroads that would define not just his relationship with Luna but his place in the only community he had ever known. He could send Luna away, return to his safe and predictable life, and maintain the approval of people who had known him since childhood. Or he could choose to follow his heart and his conscience, knowing that it would cost him the comfort of belonging to a community that valued conformity above compassion. That evening, he found Luna sitting on her porch, watching the sunset paint his wheat fields gold. She looked up when he approached, and he could see in her eyes that she had been thinking about the same choice from her own perspective. "I heard Reverend Collins was here today," she said quietly. "Mrs. Peterson at the general store made sure I knew about it when I went for supplies." "What did Mrs. Peterson say?" "That I should leave before I destroy your life the way I destroyed those children's lives." Daniel sat down beside her on the porch steps, close enough that their shoulders touched. "And what do you think?" "I think," Luna said slowly, "that maybe it's time for me to face the question I've been avoiding since I got here." "Which question is that?" She turned to look at him directly, and Daniel saw a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there when he first found her by the creek. Whether I'm going to spend the rest of my life running from who I am and what happened, or whether I'm going to find the courage to build something new. The courage Luna spoke of manifested itself in ways that surprised both of them over the following weeks. She began venturing into town for supplies despite the stares and whispers, holding her head high and responding to hostility with a dignity that gradually wore down some of the more reasonable townspeople. She started a small garden behind her cottage, growing traditional native plants alongside conventional vegetables, creating combinations that produced better yields than anyone had seen in years. Most significantly, she began teaching Daniel about sustainable farming practices that her people had used for centuries, knowledge that could help his farm thrive even during the drought years that plagued Kansas agriculture. But it was Luna's way with animals that really captured the attention of the farming community. Word spread that the McKinnon livestock had never been healthier, that their milk production had increased, and that somehow their fields seemed more fertile wherever Luna had walked. Farmers who had been suspicious of her began asking Daniel quietly about her methods, and a few brave souls even approached her directly for advice about sick cattle or failing crops. Dr. Morrison, who had grown up around both white and native communities, served as an unofficial bridge between Luna and the more open-minded residents of Millbrook. "That girl has gifts," he told Daniel one evening when he stopped by to check on Luna's healing progress. "Real gifts, not superstition. She understands the connection between healthy land, healthy animals, and healthy people in ways that medical school couldn't teach me." Despite these small victories, the opposition remained strong. A group of the most conservative church members petitioned the county sheriff to investigate Luna's legal status, hoping to find grounds for forcing her to leave. The bank president suggested to Daniel's father that the family might want to reconsider their living arrangements before it affected their standing in the community. And rumors continued to circulate about Luna's past, with each telling making her role in the fire more sinister and her presence in Millbrook more threatening. It was during this period of mounting pressure that Daniel made a decision that would shock everyone, including himself. The idea came to him during a sleepless night when he was thinking about Reverend Collins' words about the appearance of impropriety. If the community's main objection to Luna living on his property was that it suggested an inappropriate relationship, then perhaps the solution was to make their relationship completely appropriate in the eyes of society. The next morning, Daniel drove to Topeka and visited every jewelry store in the city until he found what he was looking for, a simple silver ring set with a turquoise stone that reminded him of Luna's eyes when she looked across his wheat fields. He spent the drive home rehearsing what he would say, knowing that what he was about to propose would change both their lives forever. He found Luna working in her garden, her dark hair braided back and her face peaceful in the way it became when she was working with growing things. She looked up when she heard his truck, and her smile of welcome made his heart skip in a way that confirmed he was making the right decision. "Luna," he said, sitting down beside her among the rows of corn and beans she had planted in the traditional Three Sisters pattern. "I need to ask you something important." She set down her gardening tools and gave him her full attention, sensing the seriousness in his voice. "What is it?" Daniel pulled the ring box from his pocket, noting how Luna's eyes widened when she saw it. "I know this might seem sudden, and I know our relationship hasn't been conventional. But Luna, these past 2 months have been the best of my life. You've made me see my land, my work, and myself in ways I never imagined. You've brought wisdom and beauty and purpose to everything you've touched." Luna was staring at the ring box as if it might disappear if she looked away. "Daniel, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you," Daniel said, the words coming out with a certainty that surprised him. "I'm saying that I want to spend the rest of my life learning from you, working beside you, protecting you from people who are too afraid to see how extraordinary you are. I'm saying that I want to marry you, not just to stop the town gossip, but because I can't imagine a future that doesn't include you." Luna was quiet for so long that Daniel began to worry he had misread everything between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're asking. Marrying me won't just mean dealing with disapproval from your community. It will mean connecting your life to someone who might always be haunted by tragedy, who might never fully heal from what happened. I know exactly what I'm asking, Daniel said firmly. I'm asking you to trust me with your heart the way I want to trust you with mine. I'm asking you to help me build a life that honors both of our backgrounds, both of our dreams. I'm asking you to let me love you for the rest of our lives. Luna reached out with her good hand and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw as if she was memorizing it. And what if I say yes? What if we marry and the town never accepts me? What if your family disowns you? What if the nightmares about the fire never go away? Then we'll face all of that together, Daniel said simply. Luna, I've been living a safe, predictable life for 26 years, and it wasn't until I met you that I understood I was only half alive. I'd rather face any challenge with you than live safely without you. Luna closed her eyes, and Daniel could see her fighting some internal battle between hope and fear. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears, but her voice was strong. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I want to escape my past or because I need saving, but because I love you too. Because you see me as whole when everyone else sees me as broken. Because you've given me reasons to hope for the future again. Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, the turquoise catching the morning light like a promise. There's something else, he said, pulling her into his arms. I want our wedding to honor both of our traditions. I want to exchange vows in a way that recognizes who we both are and where we both come from. Luna smiled through her tears. That will really give the town something to talk about. Let them talk, Daniel said, kissing her forehead. By the time we're finished, they'll have something much more interesting to discuss than gossip. Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic those words would prove to be. The announcement of Daniel and Luna's engagement created exactly the kind of uproar Daniel had expected, but the intensity of the reaction surprised even him. Within hours of the news spreading through Millbrook, the town had essentially divided into two camps: those who saw the marriage as a scandalous betrayal of community values, and a smaller but vocal group who admired Daniel's courage and had begun to appreciate Luna's contributions to local agriculture. Mrs. Henderson led the opposition with the fervor of someone who believed she was protecting the moral fiber of the community. She organized boycotts of businesses that served Luna, petitioned the church council to refuse to host the wedding, and even wrote letters to the county commissioner suggesting that Luna's presence was somehow damaging to property values. Reverend Collins, caught between his personal disapproval and his theological obligation to support marriage, announced that while he wouldn't refuse to perform the ceremony, he couldn't recommend it in good conscience. But unexpected allies emerged as well. Dr. Morrison offered to host the wedding reception at his large Victorian home, declaring that any woman who could heal sick animals and improve crop yields was welcome in his community. The elderly Schmidt family, whose failing dairy farm had been revived after Luna shared traditional knowledge about cattle care, quietly spread word that they would attend the wedding and support the couple. Most surprisingly, Daniel's own parents, after initial shock and worry about community reaction, came to a decision that surprised everyone, including Daniel himself. "Son," his father said during a family meeting that Daniel had been dreading, "your mother and I have been watching how this girl has changed you, and how she's helped our farm. We've also been watching how she handles the hostility from people who should know better. If you're sure about this, we're going to stand by you." His mother, a practical woman who had learned to judge people by their actions rather than their reputations, was even more direct. "That girl has more grace and dignity than half the women in this town, and she clearly loves you. If you love her back, that's all that matters to us." The wedding planning became an exercise in cultural diplomacy and creative problem-solving. Luna wanted to honor both traditions without offending either community, while Daniel was determined to create a ceremony that would celebrate their love without hiding their differences. Luna reached out to her maternal grandmother, Elena Reyes, who lived in a small Mexican-American community near Wichita and had maintained connections to both Hispanic and Native traditions. Grandmother Elena, a woman in her 70s with silver hair and eyes that sparkled with wisdom and mischief, arrived in Millbrook 3 weeks before the wedding like a force of nature. "So you're the boy who wants to marry my granddaughter," she said to Daniel when they first met, looking him up and down with the critical eye of someone who had survived decades of prejudice and hardship. "Tell me why I should trust you with the most precious thing in my world." Daniel answered honestly, speaking about his love for Luna, his respect for her strength and wisdom, his commitment to protecting her from future harm, and his desire to build a life that honored both of their backgrounds. Grandmother Elena listened without interruption, then nodded once. "Good answers. Now let me tell you about the girl you're marrying, because I don't think you know the whole story." Over the following days, Grandmother Elena filled in details about Luna's life that Daniel hadn't known. Luna had been valedictorian of her boarding school class, had been studying to become a teacher when the fire happened, and had saved the lives of 7 children before the roof collapsed. The tragedy that had driven her from the reservation wasn't that she had caused deaths, but that she had survived when the little boy she was trying to save hadn't, and some community members had blamed her for not being fast enough, strong enough, or brave enough to save everyone. "My granddaughter has been carrying guilt that belongs to God, not to her," Grandmother Elena told Daniel. "She needs a man who will remind her every day that surviving doesn't make her guilty, that loving again doesn't betray the memory of those who died, that building a new life is what those children would have wanted for her." Together, Grandmother Elena and Luna planned a wedding ceremony that would take place in the open field between Daniel's farmhouse and Luna's cottage, symbolically bridging the space between their two homes. The ceremony would include elements from Christian, Native American, and Mexican traditions, vows exchanged at sunset, sage burning for purification, ribbons of different colors representing their families and communities, and a feast that included foods from all 3 cultures. Dr. Morrison's wife, a woman who had been quietly supportive of Luna from the beginning, offered to provide flowers from her extensive garden. The Schmidt family donated milk and cheese for the reception. Even some of the more progressive church members contributed time and resources, creating a network of support that surprised the couple with its breadth and commitment. But the real surprise came from Luna herself. 3 days before the wedding, she asked Daniel to drive her to the reservation where she had worked before the fire. She hadn't been back since the tragedy, and Daniel could see how much courage the visit required. "I need to face what happened," she explained. "I need to make peace with the families of the children who died. I can't start our marriage carrying this weight." The visit to the reservation was emotionally devastating but ultimately healing. Luna met with the families of the children who had perished in the fire, offering apologies that they gently but firmly refused to accept. "You have nothing to apologize for," said Mary Crow Dog, whose 6-year-old nephew had been among the victims. "You risked your life trying to save our children. The fact that you couldn't save them all doesn't make you responsible for their deaths." The tribal elder who had investigated the fire officially cleared Luna of any blame, presenting her with a document that stated clearly that the fire had been caused by faulty electrical wiring, not by anything Luna had done or failed to do. More importantly, the families she had helped that night blessed her upcoming marriage and invited her to return to the reservation whenever she wanted. "You will always be our sister," said Robert Renning Bear, whose daughter Luna had successfully rescued. "And if this white farmer makes you happy, then he is our brother too." Luna returned to Millbrook with a lightness in her spirit that Daniel hadn't seen since he first met her. The guilt and shame that had driven her to sit alone by the creek for months had finally been lifted, replaced by a quiet joy and anticipation for the future they were about to build together. On the morning of their wedding day, as Daniel stood in his bedroom adjusting his tie and looking out the window toward the field where they would exchange vows, he realized that what had begun as an act of simple compassion had evolved into the greatest adventure of his life. In a few hours, he would marry a woman who had taught him that love could bridge any gap, that courage could overcome any prejudice, and that sometimes the most beautiful flowers grew from the most unlikely soil. The wedding ceremony took place at sunset on a crisp October evening, with golden light spreading across the Kansas plains like a blessing from heaven itself. Despite the controversy that had surrounded their engagement, nearly 100 people gathered in the field between Daniel's farmhouse and Luna's cottage, creating a diverse assembly that included white farmers, Mexican-American families from Wichita, a delegation from the reservation led by Mary Crow Dog, and even some Millbrook residents who had overcome their initial prejudices. Luna appeared at sunset wearing a white dress that Grandmother Elena had sewn by hand, incorporating traditional native beadwork around the neckline and Mexican embroidery along the hem. Her dark hair was adorned with white wildflowers and eagle feathers, and she moved with a grace that spoke of complete inner peace. Daniel wore his best suit with a turquoise biolo tie that matched Luna's engagement ring, and when he saw her walking toward him across the field, he felt his heart stop with the recognition that he was about to marry the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. The ceremony itself was unlike anything the people of Millbrook had ever witnessed. Reverend Collins performed the Christian elements, speaking about love, commitment, and the joining of two lives in God's service. Grandmother Elena led Mexican traditions, binding the couple's hands with ribbons while speaking prayers in Spanish that asked for fertility, prosperity, and long life. Mary Crow Dog conducted native rituals, burning sage to purify the space and calling upon the four directions to bless the union. But the most powerful moment came when Luna and Daniel exchanged the vows they had written themselves. Daniel spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the field in the stillness of the evening. "Luna, you came into my life when I didn't even know I was lonely. You taught me that real strength comes from vulnerability, that wisdom comes from surviving pain, and that love means seeing someone completely and choosing to stay. I promise to protect your gentle heart, to learn from your wise spirit, and to stand beside you as we build a life that honors both of our peoples and all that we've overcome together." Luna's vows brought tears to eyes throughout the gathering. "Daniel, you found me broken and never tried to fix me. Instead, you helped me remember that being scarred doesn't mean being damaged, that surviving tragedy doesn't make you guilty, and that love can heal wounds that time alone cannot touch. I promise to bring all of my gifts to our partnership, to help our land and our community flourish, and to love you with the same courage you showed when you chose to love me." When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the crowd was loud enough to be heard across the entire county. Daniel kissed Luna as the last light faded from the western sky, and as their lips met, something extraordinary happened that would be talked about in Millbrook for generations to come. The moment their kiss ended, a song began to rise from the earth itself. It started as a low humming that seemed to come from the wheat stalks surrounding the gathering, then grew into a melody that incorporated sounds from the natural world: the whisper of wind through grain, the call of evening birds, the rustle of small animals in the grass. But underneath these natural sounds was something else entirely. A harmony that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, as if the land was celebrating the union of these two people who had both suffered and both chosen love over fear. The guests looked around in wonder as the song continued, some laughing with delight, others weeping at the beauty of sounds they had never heard before but somehow recognized as deeply familiar. Children began to dance spontaneously, their movements guided by rhythms that seemed to pulse up from the ground beneath their feet. Adults found themselves swaying unconsciously, their bodies responding to music that spoke directly to their souls rather than their ears. Dr. Morrison, a man of science who had spent his life looking for rational explanations, later said he had never experienced anything like it. "It was as if the earth itself was celebrating," he told people for years afterward. "As if all the pain and division of the past few months had somehow been transformed into pure joy." Grandmother Elena, who had seen many mysteries during her long life, smiled knowingly. "This is what happens when love is strong enough to heal old wounds," she whispered to Mary Crow Dog. "The earth recognizes truth, and truth creates beauty." The celebration continued long into the night, with the mysterious music providing a backdrop for dancing, storytelling, and the kind of community bonding that transforms strangers into family. Former opponents of the marriage found themselves talking with reservation visitors about farming techniques and traditional knowledge. Children who had been taught to fear Luna were soon gathered around her, listening to stories about animals and plants that she told in a voice that seemed to carry the same magical quality as the music surrounding them. Mrs. Henderson, who had led the opposition to the marriage, stood at the edge of the gathering for most of the evening, clearly conflicted between her ingrained prejudices and the undeniable beauty of what she was witnessing. As the night grew later and the music continued, she gradually moved closer to the celebration, until finally she approached Luna directly. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice barely audible above the continuing song. "I was afraid of what I didn't understand, and I let that fear turn into something ugly. Can you forgive an old woman who should have known better?" Luna took Mrs. Henderson's hands in both of hers, and when she smiled, her face seemed to glow with the same light that illuminated the entire gathering. "Mrs. Henderson, there's nothing to forgive. Fear is natural when we encounter something unfamiliar. What matters is that you found the courage to move beyond fear toward understanding." As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, the music gradually faded, leaving Daniel and Luna alone in the field where they had exchanged vows. They walked hand in hand toward the farmhouse that would now be their shared home, marveling at the transformation that had taken place not just in their own lives but in their entire community. "Did you expect anything like that?" Luna asked, gesturing toward the field where traces of the mysterious music still seemed to linger in the air. "Never," Daniel replied. "But somehow it feels completely right. Like the land was waiting for us to show everyone that different doesn't mean dangerous, that love really can overcome fear." As they reached the porch of their home, Luna paused to look back at the field one more time. "Tomorrow morning, when people wake up and remember what happened here tonight, everything will be different." "Different how?" Daniel asked. Luna smiled, and in her eyes Daniel saw not the wounded girl he had found by the creek, but a woman who had found her true power through love and acceptance. "Tomorrow, when they look at these fields, they won't just see crops growing. They'll see proof that magic happens when people choose love over fear, when communities choose inclusion over division, when the earth itself celebrates the healing of old wounds." And indeed, when the sun rose the next morning, Daniel's fields were full of song. Daniel woke before dawn on the first morning of his married life to find Luna already up, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the sun rise over fields that seemed somehow different from the day before. There was a quality to the light that he had never noticed, a richness in the colors of the wheat and corn that made everything look more vibrant, more alive. More than that, there was an actual sound coming from the fields, a soft humming that seemed to rise with the morning mist, creating a gentle symphony that made the entire farm feel like a place touched by something beyond the ordinary. "Is that what I think it is?" Daniel asked, wrapping his arms around Luna from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "The same music from last night?" "It's still here," Luna said softly, leaning back against his chest. "Different, gentler, but definitely still here. Daniel, I think something permanent happened yesterday, something that changed not just us but this entire place." They walked out to the fields together, and what they found amazed them both. The wheat that had been nearly ready for harvest yesterday was now fully mature, golden and heavy with grain that should have taken another 2 weeks to develop. The vegetable garden that Luna had planted behind her cottage had somehow tripled in size overnight, with plants that were fuller, healthier, and more productive than anything either of them had ever seen. But most remarkably, there were new plants growing throughout the property, wildflowers and herbs that hadn't been there the day before, creating natural borders and pathways that seemed to have been designed by an invisible landscape artist. "Luna," Daniel said, kneeling down to examine a cluster of plants he didn't recognize. "What are these?" Luna knelt beside him, her face lighting up with recognition and wonder. "These are traditional medicine plants that my grandmother taught me about. This is sweetgrass, used for purification. This is echinacea for healing. This is wild sage, and this, Daniel, this is ghost medicine, a plant that's supposed to help heal spiritual wounds. It hasn't grown wild in Kansas for over 100 years." By mid-morning, word of the changes at the McKinnon farm had spread throughout Millbrook. Dr. Morrison was the first to arrive, bringing his medical curiosity and his camera to document what was clearly an unprecedented phenomenon. He was followed by the Schmidt family, who had noticed that their own dairy farm seemed somehow improved since the wedding, with their cows producing richer milk and their pastures looking greener. Soon, a steady stream of visitors was making its way to the farm, some coming out of scientific curiosity, others drawn by rumors of miraculous changes, and still others hoping that whatever had happened might somehow benefit their own struggling agricultural operations. What they found challenged everything they thought they understood about farming, nature, and the possible intersection between spiritual and physical reality. The McKinnon farm had become something resembling a botanical garden, with plants arranged in patterns that followed traditional Native American agricultural wisdom but executed with a precision and abundance that seemed to exceed natural limitations. The music that continued to emanate from the fields created an atmosphere of peace and productivity that visitors said made them feel calmer and more hopeful than they had in years. Luna became an informal guide, explaining to fascinated visitors how different plants supported each other, how traditional companion planting could increase yields while reducing the need for artificial fertilizers and pesticides, and how working with natural cycles rather than against them could create sustainable abundance. Her knowledge, which had impressed Daniel from the beginning, now had visible proof in the form of thriving crops and medicine plants that seemed to have appeared overnight. But the most profound changes weren't in the plants themselves, but in the people who came to see them. Mrs. Henderson returned the day after the wedding with her church auxiliary group, ostensibly to examine the unusual agricultural developments, but clearly hoping to find rational explanations for what they had experienced during the ceremony. Instead, they found themselves staying for hours, helping Luna harvest herbs for a traditional medicine kit she was assembling, listening to stories about sustainable farming practices, and gradually opening their minds to ways of understanding the world that were different from anything they had been taught. "I've been farming this land for 40 years, said Tom Mueller, whose property bordered the McKinnon farm. "And I've never seen anything like this. But it's not just the plants, Luna. It's the feeling of this place. It's like the earth is happy here." Reverend Collins arrived in the afternoon, bringing with him a complex mixture of theological curiosity and pastoral concern. He had heard reports of supernatural occurrences, and felt obligated to investigate whether his parishioners were being exposed to influences that might conflict with their Christian faith. What he found instead was Luna teaching a group of children about the medicinal properties of plants while incorporating discussions about stewardship, gratitude, and respect for creation that sounded entirely consistent with his own theological teachings. "Miss Luna. I mean Mrs. McKinnon," he said, approaching her hesitantly. "I need to ask you directly. Do you attribute these changes to supernatural forces? Are you practicing some form of witchcraft or indigenous magic that my congregation should be concerned about?" Luna looked at him with the same patience she showed everyone, understanding that his questions came from genuine concern rather than hostility. "Reverend Collins, I think what happened here comes from the same source as everything good in this world: love, hope, and the healing that happens when people choose understanding over fear. Whether you call that God's work or natural magic or the power of community coming together, I think it's all the same thing." Her answer seemed to satisfy the Reverend, who spent the next hour walking through the fields and observing the undeniable sense of peace and productivity that characterized the entire farm. When he left, he made a statement that would be repeated throughout Millbrook for years to come. "I don't know exactly what happened here, but I know good fruit when I see it, and nothing but good is growing on this land." By evening, Daniel and Luna found themselves hosting an impromptu community gathering on their front porch, with neighbors who had driven from miles around to see the singing fields, and to meet the woman whose marriage had somehow transformed the landscape itself. The conversation ranged from practical discussions about farming techniques to philosophical questions about the relationship between human emotions and the natural world, but underlying it all was a sense of community that transcended the divisions that had existed just days before. As the last visitors departed and Daniel and Luna finally had time alone together, they sat on their porch swing and marveled at how completely their world had changed in less than 24 hours. "Do you think it will last?" Daniel asked, gesturing toward the fields where the gentle music continued to drift through the evening air. Daniel woke before dawn on the first morning of his married life to find Luna already up, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee in her hands, watching the sun rise over fields that seemed somehow different from the day before. There was a quality to the light that he had never noticed, a richness in the colors of the wheat and corn that made everything look more vibrant, more alive. More than that, there was an actual sound coming from the fields, a soft humming that seemed to rise with the morning mist, creating a gentle symphony that made the entire farm feel like a place touched by something beyond the ordinary. "Is that what I think it is?" Daniel asked, wrapping his arms around Luna from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. "The same music from last night?" "It's still here," Luna said softly, leaning back against his chest. "Different, gentler, but definitely still here. Daniel, I think something permanent happened yesterday, something that changed not just us but this entire place." They walked out to the fields together, and what they found amazed them both. The wheat that had been nearly ready for harvest yesterday was now fully mature, golden and heavy with grain that should have taken another 2 weeks to develop. The vegetable garden that Luna had planted behind her cottage had somehow tripled in size overnight, with plants that were fuller, healthier, and more productive than anything either of them had ever seen. But most remarkably, there were new plants growing throughout the property, wildflowers and herbs that hadn't been there the day before, creating natural borders and pathways that seemed to have been designed by an invisible landscape artist. "Luna," Daniel said, kneeling down to examine a cluster of plants he didn't recognize. "What are these?" Luna knelt beside him, her face lighting up with recognition and wonder. "These are traditional medicine plants that my grandmother taught me about. This is sweetgrass, used for purification. This is echinacea for healing. This is wild sage, and this, Daniel, this is ghost medicine, a plant that's supposed to help heal spiritual wounds. It hasn't grown wild in Kansas for over 100 years. By mid-morning, word of the changes at the McKinnon farm had spread throughout Millbrook. Dr. Morrison was the first to arrive, bringing his medical curiosity and his camera to document what was clearly an unprecedented phenomenon. He was followed by the Schmidt family, who had noticed that their own dairy farm seemed somehow improved since the wedding, with their cows producing richer milk and their pastures looking greener. Soon, a steady stream of visitors was making its way to the farm, some coming out of scientific curiosity, others drawn by rumors of miraculous changes, and still others hoping that whatever had happened might somehow benefit their own struggling agricultural operations. What they found challenged everything they thought they understood about farming, nature, and the possible intersection between spiritual and physical reality. The McKinnon farm had become something resembling a botanical garden, with plants arranged in patterns that followed traditional Native American agricultural wisdom but executed with a precision and abundance that seemed to exceed natural limitations. The music that continued to emanate from the fields created an atmosphere of peace and productivity that visitors said made them feel calmer and more hopeful than they had in years. Luna became an informal guide, explaining to fascinated visitors how different plants supported each other, how traditional companion planting could increase yields while reducing the need for artificial fertilizers and pesticides, and how working with natural cycles rather than against them could create sustainable abundance. Her knowledge, which had impressed Daniel from the beginning, now had visible proof in the form of thriving crops and medicine plants that seemed to have appeared overnight. But the most profound changes weren't in the plants themselves, but in the people who came to see them. Mrs. Henderson returned the day after the wedding with her church auxiliary group, ostensibly to examine the unusual agricultural developments, but clearly hoping to find rational explanations for what they had experienced during the ceremony. Instead, they found themselves staying for hours, helping Luna harvest herbs for a traditional medicine kit she was assembling, listening to stories about sustainable farming practices, and gradually opening their minds to ways of understanding the world that were different from anything they had been taught. "I've been farming this land for 40 years, said Tom Mueller, whose property bordered the McKinnon farm. "And I've never seen anything like this. But it's not just the plants, Luna. It's the feeling of this place. It's like the earth is happy here." Reverend Collins arrived in the afternoon, bringing with him a complex mixture of theological curiosity and pastoral concern. He had heard reports of supernatural occurrences, and felt obligated to investigate whether his parishioners were being exposed to influences that might conflict with their Christian faith. What he found instead was Luna teaching a group of children about the medicinal properties of plants while incorporating discussions about stewardship, gratitude, and respect for creation that sounded entirely consistent with his own theological teachings. "Miss Luna. I mean Mrs. McKinnon," he said, approaching her hesitantly. "I need to ask you directly. Do you attribute these changes to supernatural forces? Are you practicing some form of witchcraft or indigenous magic that my congregation should be concerned about?" Luna looked at him with the same patience she showed everyone, understanding that his questions came from genuine concern rather than hostility. "Reverend Collins, I think what happened here comes from the same source as everything good in this world: love, hope, and the healing that happens when people choose understanding over fear. Whether you call that God's work or natural magic or the power of community coming together, I think it's all the same thing." Her answer seemed to satisfy the Reverend, who spent the next hour walking through the fields and observing the undeniable sense of peace and productivity that characterized the entire farm. When he left, he made a statement that would be repeated throughout Millbrook for years to come. "I don't know exactly what happened here, but I know good fruit when I see it, and nothing but good is growing on this land." By evening, Daniel and Luna found themselves hosting an impromptu community gathering on their front porch, with neighbors who had driven from miles around to see the singing fields, and to meet the woman whose marriage had somehow transformed the landscape itself. The conversation ranged from practical discussions about farming techniques to philosophical questions about the relationship between human emotions and the natural world, but underlying it all was a sense of community that transcended the divisions that had existed just days before. As the last visitors departed and Daniel and Luna finally had time alone together, they sat on their porch swing and marveled at how completely their world had changed in less than 24 hours. "Do you think it will last?" Daniel asked, gesturing toward the fields where the gentle music continued to drift through the evening air. "The music, the plants, the way people are treating each other?" Luna was quiet for a moment, her head resting on Daniel's shoulder as they watched stars appear in the darkening sky. "I think it will last as long as we remember what created it," she said finally. "Love, acceptance, the courage to choose hope over fear. The earth responded to those things, and it will keep responding as long as we keep practicing them. And if we forget, then I suppose the music will fade, and the magic will become just a story people tell about the time when something extraordinary happened in a little town in Kansas." But looking at the faces of the people who had visited their farm that day, listening to the conversations about cooperation and understanding that were already taking root in their community, Luna felt confident that forgetting would not be a problem for Millbrook. Within a month of Daniel and Luna's wedding, the changes that had begun on their farm spread throughout the Millbrook community in ways that surprised everyone. It started with practical matters. Neighboring farmers began implementing companion planting techniques that Luna had demonstrated, and several reported increased yields and healthier soil. Dr. Morrison started incorporating traditional herbal remedies into his medical practice after seeing how effectively Luna's plant preparations worked for various ailments. The local school invited Luna to teach a weekly class about traditional ecological knowledge, and children who had once crossed the street to avoid her now competed for her attention during nature walks that had become the highlight of their week. But the more profound changes were in the social fabric of the town itself. The community divisions that had seemed insurmountable just months earlier began to heal through shared work and common purpose. When the Hendersons' barn caught fire during a lightning storm, families from the reservation traveled 50 miles to help with rebuilding, working side by side with white farmers who had never spoken to a native person before. When Mrs. Schmidt fell ill, Luna organized a care network that included women from all the different communities around Millbrook, creating friendships that crossed racial and cultural lines. The economic benefits were undeniable as well. Tourism increased as word spread about the singing fields and the remarkable agricultural developments. Visitors came from universities to study sustainable farming practices, from medical schools to learn about traditional plant medicines, and from other farming communities hoping to understand how to create similar abundance on their own land. Luna started selling herbal preparations and traditional craft items, while Daniel's farm became a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture techniques that other farmers traveled hundreds of miles to observe. The local newspaper, which had initially been skeptical about the unusual developments at the McKinnon farm, now published weekly articles about sustainable agriculture, indigenous knowledge, and the economic benefits of cultural diversity. The reporter who had once referred to Luna as The mysterious Indian girl now wrote respectfully about her innovations in traditional farming and her contributions to community health and prosperity. But perhaps the most significant change was in Luna herself. The wounded, isolated young woman who had sat alone by Miller's Creek for months had blossomed into a confident leader who moved easily between different communities, translating not just languages but entire ways of understanding the world. She started a monthly gathering called Women's Wisdom Circle, where women from all backgrounds shared traditional knowledge about cooking, medicine, childcare, and agriculture. She established a seed library where farmers could access heritage varieties of plants that had been adapted to local conditions over generations. Most importantly, she became a bridge between communities that had existed in isolation from each other for decades. Daniel watched his wife's transformation with amazement and pride. The shy, careful woman he had married had revealed herself to be a natural teacher and leader whose gifts had been suppressed by trauma and rejection. Now, surrounded by people who valued her knowledge and respected her contributions, she had found her true calling as someone who could heal not just physical ailments, but social divisions. "I never imagined this," Luna told him one evening as they walked through fields that continued to hum with gentle music 6 months after their wedding. "When I was sitting by that creek, I thought my life was over. I thought I would always be someone defined by tragedy, by failure, by being unwanted. And now?" Daniel asked, though he could see the answer in her face. "Now I understand that everything I went through, the fire, the blame, the isolation, even the months of sitting alone, all of that prepared me for this. I had to learn about loss before I could appreciate abundance. I had to experience rejection before I could understand the value of acceptance. I had to be broken before I could learn how to help others heal." The success of their model attracted attention from beyond Kansas. Agricultural extension agents came to study their methods. University researchers documented the increased biodiversity and improved soil health on their farm. Medical professionals recorded the health benefits that community members experienced from incorporating traditional plant medicines into their healthcare routines. A documentary crew spent 2 weeks filming what they called the Millbrook Miracle. Though Luna insisted that what had happened wasn't miraculous at all, it was simply the natural result of people choosing cooperation over conflict, understanding over fear, and love over hate. Representatives from other farming communities across the Midwest began visiting, hoping to replicate the social and agricultural transformations they had witnessed in Millbrook. Luna and Daniel found themselves traveling to conferences and workshops, sharing their story and the practical knowledge that had emerged from their experience. They always emphasized that the magic wasn't in any particular technique or ritual, but in the willingness of a community to open their minds to different ways of knowing and being. As their first anniversary approached, Daniel and Luna decided to host a celebration that would include everyone who had been part of their journey: reservation families, Mexican-American communities from Wichita, longtime Millbrook residents, and new friends from across the region who had been drawn to their story. The event would be held in the same field where they had been married, but this time it would celebrate not just their love but the transformation of an entire community. "A year ago, I was afraid to propose to you because I thought it would cause too much controversy," Daniel told Luna as they planned the anniversary celebration. "I never imagined that our marriage would end up bringing so many different people together." "That's because you were thinking about marriage as something that happens between two people," Luna replied. "But in traditional indigenous culture, marriage is understood as something that connects families, communities, and ways of life. When we got married, we weren't just joining our lives, we were creating bridges between worlds that had been separated for too long." As they sent invitations to people from dozens of different communities and backgrounds, Daniel realized that Luna was right. Their wedding hadn't just been the beginning of their personal happiness, it had been the catalyst for healing divisions that had existed for generations. And as the music continued to drift from fields that grew more abundant each season, he understood that they had somehow participated in something much larger than either of them had imagined possible. The first anniversary celebration drew over 300 people to the McKinnon farm, creating a gathering that resembled a small festival more than a personal milestone. Families arrived from reservations across Kansas and Oklahoma, Mexican-American communities sent delegations from as far away as Colorado, and farming families from throughout the Midwest came to celebrate what had become a symbol of how love could overcome prejudice and create abundance. The celebration lasted 3 days, with camping in the fields, shared meals that incorporated traditions from dozens of different cultures, workshops on sustainable agriculture and traditional crafts, and storytelling sessions that went late into each night. But the most remarkable aspect of the gathering was how naturally people from completely different backgrounds found common ground. Children played together regardless of race or language, elderly women shared cooking techniques and family stories, and men who had never left their own counties found themselves deep in conversation with farmers from entirely different cultural traditions. Dr. Morrison, who had become something of an informal historian of the changes in Millbrook, documented the event with both photographs and interviews. "What I'm seeing here," he told a reporter from the Kansas City Star, "is proof that diversity isn't just morally right, it's practically beneficial. This community has become healthier, more prosperous, and more resilient by learning to value different ways of knowing and being." The reporter, Sarah Chin, had come to write a human interest story about an unusual marriage but found herself documenting what she would later describe as a new model for rural American communities in the 21st century. She interviewed farmers who had increased their yields by incorporating traditional indigenous techniques, business owners who had expanded their customer base by serving diverse communities, and children who were growing up bilingual and bicultural in ways that prepared them for an increasingly connected world. Luna had become the informal coordinator of what people were starting to call the Millbrook Model, an approach to community development that emphasized cultural exchange, sustainable agriculture, traditional knowledge, and inclusive economic development. She received requests for consultations from communities across the country that wanted to build bridges between different populations while creating environmental and economic benefits. The key, Luna explained to visitors who came to learn from their experience, is understanding that diversity is a resource, not a problem. Every culture has developed knowledge about how to live successfully in different environments. When you bring that knowledge together, you create possibilities that none of the individual cultures could achieve alone. Daniel had taken on the role of documenting and teaching the agricultural innovations that had emerged from combining traditional indigenous practices with modern farming techniques. Their farm had become a demonstration site for sustainable agriculture, hosting regular workshops for farmers who wanted to reduce their dependence on expensive chemical inputs while increasing their yields and improving their soil health. The economic impact of their approach was undeniable. Production costs had decreased while profits had increased, and the farm was supporting twice as many families as it had before Luna's arrival. But the couple's greatest pride was in the social changes they had helped facilitate. Millbrook had become a destination for people seeking examples of successful multicultural communities. The town's main street, which had been struggling with empty storefronts and declining population, now hosted businesses owned by people from different cultural backgrounds. A restaurant specializing in fusion cuisine that combined Mexican, Native American, and traditional American foods. A craft cooperative where artisans from different traditions shared techniques and markets. A community health center that integrated conventional medicine with traditional healing practices. The school system had been transformed as well. Luna's weekly ecology classes had evolved into a comprehensive program that taught children about different cultural approaches to understanding the natural world. Students learned Spanish and basic words in several native languages. They studied history from multiple perspectives, understanding how different peoples had adapted to life on the Great Plains. Most importantly, they grew up seeing diversity as normal, valuable, and beneficial rather than as something to be feared or avoided. As the anniversary celebration continued into its second day, with workshops on traditional medicine, sustainable agriculture, and multicultural education, Daniel and Luna found themselves reflecting on how much their lives had changed since that morning when he had found her collapsed by Miller's Creek. "Do you ever miss the simplicity of how things were before?" Daniel asked as they walked through fields that now hosted demonstration plots showing different traditional farming techniques from cultures around the world. "When it was just the two of us figuring out how to love each other?" Luna considered the question seriously, watching children from a dozen different backgrounds playing together while their parents shared knowledge about plant medicine and soil conservation. "I loved those quiet months when we were first together," she said. "But Daniel, look around. We didn't lose that intimacy, we multiplied it. Every person whose life has been improved by what we've learned, every child who's growing up without the prejudices their grandparents carried, every farmer who's improving their land while increasing their profits, all of that grew from the love we found together." They paused at the edge of the field where they had been married exactly 1 year earlier. The cottonwood tree by Miller's Creek was visible in the distance, the place where Luna had spent those months in isolation, carrying guilt and trauma that had nearly destroyed her spirit. Now, children were playing around that same tree, and a small memorial garden had been planted nearby to honor the memory of the children who had died in the fire that changed Luna's life. "I think," Luna said, taking Daniel's hand, "that those children who died in the fire would be happy to see what grew from their tragedy. Not because their deaths were worth it, nothing could make their deaths worth it. But because their memory inspired something beautiful, because the guilt I carried about not saving them eventually motivated me to dedicate my life to healing others." The second night of the celebration featured a ceremony led by elders from several different native tribes, honoring not just Daniel and Luna's marriage, but the healing that had taken place in the broader community. Mary Crow Dog, who had become like a mother to Luna, spoke about forgiveness, resilience, and the power of love to transform even the most painful experiences into sources of strength. Grandmother Elena, now in her 80s but still sharp and energetic, talked about the importance of building bridges between generations and cultures. "What my granddaughter and her husband have shown us," she said to the gathered crowd, "is that love doesn't diminish when you share it with more people, it grows stronger. Community doesn't weaken when you include different kinds of people, it becomes more resilient. And healing doesn't happen in isolation, it happens when people come together to support each other through their pain and their growth." As the evening wound down and the music from the field seemed to crescendo in celebration, Daniel and Luna stood together in the same spot where they had exchanged vows a year earlier. Around them, hundreds of people from dozens of different backgrounds were sharing food, stories, and laughter under stars that seemed brighter than either of them remembered. "What do you think will happen next?" Daniel asked, gesturing toward the gathering that had grown far beyond anything they had imagined when they first fell in love. "I think," Luna said, smiling as she watched children playing games that combined traditions from multiple cultures, "that we're going to keep growing, keep learning, and keep proving that love really can change the world, one community at a time." 5 years after Daniel first found Luna by Miller's Creek, their story had become legend throughout the Midwest. But the reality of their life together was even more extraordinary than the stories people told. The McKinnon farm had evolved into something unprecedented, a thriving agricultural cooperative that supported 47 families from 12 different cultural backgrounds, a research center where universities sent students to study sustainable farming and cross-cultural collaboration, and a pilgrimage site for people seeking examples of how love could literally transform the landscape. The changes weren't just anecdotal, they were measurable and replicable. Soil samples showed dramatic improvements in health and fertility across the entire region. Economic studies documented increased prosperity for all community members, not just those directly involved in the agricultural innovations. Health statistics showed improvements in both physical and mental wellness indicators, which researchers attributed to the combination of better nutrition from diverse crops, traditional medicines, and the psychological benefits of living in a cohesive, supportive community. Children who had grown up in the transformed Millbrook were being accepted to universities across the country, many of them choosing to study agriculture, environmental science, or cultural anthropology, planning to return and continue the work their community had started. They were bilingual or trilingual, comfortable moving between different cultural contexts, and uniquely prepared to navigate an increasingly diverse world. Luna had become a nationally recognized expert on sustainable agriculture and community development, traveling to speak at conferences and consult with communities that wanted to replicate the Millbrook model. She had written 2 books, Healing the Land, Healing the Community, about sustainable farming practices that honored traditional indigenous knowledge, and Seeds of Understanding, about building bridges between different cultural communities. Both had become required reading in graduate programs across the country. But her most important work remained local, in the community that had embraced her and been transformed by her presence. Daniel had taken over much of the day-to-day coordination of the agricultural cooperative, while also serving on the county commission and the state board of sustainable agriculture. He had never imagined that the shy bachelor farmer he had been would become someone who regularly testified before state legislatures about rural economic development and environmental policy. Yet the transformation felt natural, the inevitable result of learning to see his land and his community through Luna's eyes. Their personal life had grown as rich and complex as their public work. They had 2 children now, Elena, 3 years old and already showing Luna's intuitive understanding of plants and animals, and David, 18 months old and fascinated by machinery and building things like his father. Both children were growing up trilingual, equally comfortable with English, Spanish, and the Kiowa words that Luna sang to them as lullabies. They played with children from dozens of different cultural backgrounds, attended school in a building where multiple languages were heard in the hallways, and considered it completely normal that their dinner table might include guests from 3 different continents discussing farming techniques, traditional medicine, or political philosophy. The music that had first emerged from their fields on their wedding night had never completely faded. It was subtler now, usually noticeable only during important moments, when new crops were planted, when children were born, when conflicts were resolved through dialogue and compromise rather than division and hostility. Visitors often commented on the sense of peace that pervaded the entire area, a feeling that something fundamental was right with the world in this particular place. Dr. Morrison, now in his 70s, had become the unofficial chronicler of what locals simply called the changes. He maintained detailed records of the agricultural, economic, and social transformations that had taken place since Daniel and Luna's wedding, creating a database that researchers from around the world consulted when studying community development and sustainable agriculture. What happened here, he often told visitors, proves that the problems we face in rural America, economic decline, environmental degradation, social division, aren't inevitable. They're the result of choices we make about how to treat each other and how to treat the land. When we make different choices, we get different results. On a warm evening in early October, exactly 5 years after their wedding, Daniel and Luna walked through fields that now supported more diverse crops than had ever been grown in Kansas. They passed demonstration plots where farmers from other states were learning about companion planting, medicinal gardens where community members gathered herbs for health and healing, and playgrounds where children who would grow up to be the next generation of agricultural innovators chased each other between rows of heritage corn and traditional beans. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped to help you that morning? Daniel asked as they reached the cottonwood tree by Miller's Creek where Luna had spent those months in isolation. If I had driven past like everyone else did? Luna smiled, touching the bark of the tree that had sheltered her during her darkest period. I think the universe would have found another way to bring us together, she said. But I'm grateful it happened the way it did, because every moment of pain I experienced before I met you taught me something I needed to know to do this work. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over fields that hummed softly with life and contentment. In the distance, they could see the lights coming on in houses where families from different cultural backgrounds were preparing dinners that combined traditions from around the world, where children were doing homework in multiple languages, where neighbors had become extended family through shared work and common purpose. The children who died in that fire, Luna said softly, speaking of the tragedy that had driven her from her original home. I think about them every day. But I don't feel guilty anymore. I feel grateful that surviving gave me the chance to help create something that would make them proud. What do you think they would think of all this? Daniel asked, gesturing toward the thriving community that had grown from their love and Luna's determination to heal. I think they would be amazed that so much life and joy and abundance could grow from so much pain. I think they would be proud that their memory inspired something that helps other children grow up in a world with less fear and more understanding. As they walked back toward their house, where Grandmother Elena was reading bedtime stories to their children in a mixture of Spanish and English while traditional indigenous lullabies played softly in the background, Daniel realized that they had created something even more valuable than the agricultural abundance, or the economic prosperity, or the social harmony that had attracted attention from around the world. They had proven that love really could transform anything, scarred earth into fertile fields, divided communities into cooperative networks, wounded hearts into sources of healing for others. That night, as they had every night for 5 years, they fell asleep to the sound of music rising from fields full of promise, carried on wind that seemed to whisper that the best was yet to come. And indeed, when the sun rose the next morning, Daniel's fields were still full of song.